Within the folds of modern science appears perhaps the greatest untold story of our generation. It is the simple but seismic truth that the psyche is capable of gleaning information beyond the five senses and all known technology. In plainest terms, this capacity is called extrasensory perception, or ESP. Decades of replicated and bulletproof findings validate this rejected fact of human nature. We are beings both material and immaterial, physically limited and elevated by laws and forces we've only begun to codify. Join me, Mitch Horowitz, as I explore the history, struggles, and proofs of parapsychology, uncovering the extraordinary evidence that ESP is real. Episode 4, The Empire Strikes Back. American Cold Warriors had no intention of falling behind their Soviet counterparts in parapsychology or anything else. The Soviets' prize psychic spy, a Russian housewife named Nina Kulagina, demonstrated PK abilities said capable of moving physical objects such as pendulums or watch hands, and even levitating ping pong balls. Kulagina was said to be capable of stopping a frog's heart and reviving a fish's. No charges of fraud were ever substantiated by Western or Eastern scientists. Alarmed over intelligence that the Soviets are using psychic spies, the CIA begins funding its own distant spying program, Operation Stargate, in 1972. Stargate's key researchers, physicists Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff, coined the term remote viewing.
For the past 10 years, we've been investigating a phenomenon called remote viewing. We found that many individuals are able to accurately describe what's going on in distant locations, blocked from any kind of ordinary perception. As a physicist, I would have to say one of the findings is that the mind is no longer limited by the parameters of the body. The person's consciousness and awareness is able to transcend space and time and describe what is going on hundreds or thousands of miles away or hours or days in the future.
The controversial program, whose subjects include psychic artist Ingo Swann, lasts more than 20 years. In one of Stargate's most heralded successes, a pair of remote viewers in May 1978 identify the coordinates of a crashed Soviet Tupolev 22 spy plane in the jungles of Zaire in Central Africa. The plane was on an intelligence gathering mission when it went down, providing a potential payload of Soviet intelligence technology. Due to the coordinates and data supplied by remote viewers, which included a drawing of the tail of a plane emerging from a river, American reconnaissance and recovery teams are able to beat Soviet counterparts to the crash site, scoring a major intelligence victory. Recalling the episode in a 1995 talk at Emory University, former President Jimmy Carter said one of the remote viewers went into a trance and gave some latitude and longitude figures. We focused our satellite cameras on that point, and the plane was there. However much the program enjoyed, for a time, insider support, it also ignited vituperative opposition from skeptics who considered it an eccentric and outlandish government boondoggle to Targ, Puthoff, and other psi researchers at the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, where Stargate was often housed. The U.S.-Soviet arms race was one of constant one-upmanship, not only in terms of weapon systems and nuclear missiles, but in terms of espionage, allies, outposts, technology. The notion was that if the Soviets are doing it and we're not doing it, we are going to be on the losing end of the Cold War. It was really still a 1950s mindset. Cold War politics, as we knew them in the Eisenhower era, had not changed. And whether or not top brass at the CIA was interested in psychical research, if the Russians were doing it, we have to do it. And so we did. And this program, Operation Stargate, lasted 20 years at a cost of $20 million. And it must be pointed out that in an age of $10,000 wrenches and toilet seats at the Pentagon, $20 million was relative peanuts. And it forwarded research not only on a defense and espionage level, but on an overall social sciences and intellectual level. When the funding was cut, some people triumphantly said, "Good, it's about time we stopped wasting the taxpayers' money." I can think of few leaner targets than Operation Stargate to save the taxpayer money. In less august settings, self-proclaimed psychic Uri Geller evoked howls of pushback from skeptical voices, especially after Geller's infamous failure to significantly bend a spoon or perform other psychic feats live on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show in 1973.
I've been reading a lot of research on him from the Stanford Research Institute and from the science section of the New York Times. A lot of publicity on this gentleman whose name is Uri, U-R-I, Uri Geller. He is from Israel, and he's been the subject of a lot of study and quite a bit of controversy. He says that he claims to have been born, as I understand it, with the power of having psychokinetic ability, which is the movement of objects by sometimes not touching them by the mind, but without any physical touching of the objects. He has been on shows where objects have bent, things have broken just by touching them. And he's most interesting. And I tend to be sometimes skeptical, which may not be fair to him. You should probably have an open mind on this. But I would like to mention that he will be at Houston, Texas on September the 20th, and New York City's Town Hall on the 25th. And we hope we're going to see some rather astounding things tonight. Would you welcome, please, Uri Geller. Nice to see you.
Thanks.
We have only met...
This scares me.
This scares you? Well, we just got some things together here.
Well, Uri, Johnny concluded, I don't want you to feel bad about this tonight. The monologue doesn't work every night either. For Geller and his supporters, it was the equivalent of the first Trump-Biden debate in 2024. Contrary to cultural legend, however, a rewatch of Geller's 20-minute appearance does show an arguable instance of PK. As the camera zeroes in, Johnny acknowledges Geller's spoon has a slight bend in it. Disgusted with the popularity of parapsychological themes in American life, and resiliently unwilling to distinguish between serious efforts like the Rhine Lab and Stargate versus the media showmanship of Geller and like performers, in 1976, a cohort of ideological skeptics, including stage magician James the Amazing Randi, organized Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, or CSICOP. Announcing the group's aim, CSICOP Executive Director, philosophy professor Lee Nisbet, told Science magazine in 1977, "We feel it is the duty of the scientific community to show that these beliefs are utterly screwball." Among the founding circle of CSICOP is a brilliant sociologist, Marcello Truzzi, who called himself a constructive skeptic of paranormal phenomena. In 1975 and again in 1978, Truzzi, a man of even temperament, refined ethics, and dedicated but authentically questioning skepticism, stated a principle, not wholly original to him, later popularized by astronomer Carl Sagan. Truzzi's maxim was, an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary proof. The widely quoted precept, redubbed the Sagan standard, was repeated by the televised astronomer in 1980 as, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In an acceptance of the tacit challenge, Sagan's adaptation forms the title of this podcast. Truzzi resigned from the Professional Skeptics Organization, later dubbed Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, CSI, about a year after its 1976 launch. Truzzi protested the group's dominance by what he called pseudo-skeptics, more interested in injurious behavior toward claimants of the paranormal versus actual skeptical inquiry. I found myself attacked by the committee members and board who considered me to be too soft on the paranormalists, he later wrote. My position was not to treat proto-scientists as adversaries, but to look to the best of them and ask them for their best scientific evidence. I found that the committee was much more interested in attacking the most publicly visible claimants. The major interest of the committee was not inquiry, but to serve as an advocacy body, a public relations group for scientific orthodoxy. In particular, CSICOP grew engulfed by a scandal in which members, seeking to disprove a prominent astrological study, instead validated its findings and suppressed their own results. In 1980, the CSICOPs endeavored to rerun a section of research by French psychologist Michel Gauquelin, which tracked the significance of the planet Mars in the astrological charts of champion athletes, a phenomenon dubbed the Mars effect. The skeptic cops replicated Gauquelin's study, found its data confirmatory, but obfuscated the results, leading to further controversies and resignations within the organization. Truzzi and his colleagues explored the matter in a short-lived but vibrant journal he edited, Zetetic Scholar, an organ of constructive skepticism, which featured articles by skeptics and parapsychologists alike. The issues weren't limited to the inside baseball of skeptic parapsychologist debates. In his famous 1974 commencement address at Caltech, Cargo Cult Science, physicist Richard Feynman pilloried purveyors of junk and pseudoscience like ESP, UFOs, and astrology. The problem, Feynman said, is embracing confirmation or correlation versus laboring to disprove a favored hypothesis. Ironically, the Nobel laureate identified the very pattern, belief aforethought, into which most ideological skeptics fall. Such a case occurred in January 1979 when theoretical physicist John Archibald Wheeler stumbled in his effort to get the American Association for the Advancement of Science to expel the Parapsychological Association, the professional society for parapsychologists. Wheeler's address at the Society's annual meeting, which included his paper, Drive the Pseudos Out of the Workshop of Science, also reprinted in the New York Review of Books, a steady source of confident skepticism, the physicist falsely accused Rhine, then 83 and recovering from a stroke, of fraud as a student, noting he started parapsychology that way. Although unchallenged at the Houston conference, which a convalescing Rhine did not attend, the physicist stingily retracted his charge, accompanied by Rhine's response in the July 1979 Science magazine, Parapsychology, a Correction. In response to one of the questions from the floor, Wheeler wrote, the question came from none other than Charles Honorton, who objected to Wheeler's flamboyant and off-topic examples. I unwisely repeated a second-hand and, as it turned out, incorrect account of the experiments of Rhine and McDougall on lab rats. Wheeler failed to detail his own false charges, which ran far longer than his retraction. If parapsychologists Ethicists and defenders of free inquiry were hoping for any chastening. They were disappointed. Professional skeptics, often through CSICOP and Prometheus books, continued publishing a vast array of pamphlets, books, and articles, often confusing the public and repeating demonstrably false claims about scientific parapsychology, including maudlin and misleading descriptions of Rhine's work. To this day, probably about 8 out of 10 of parapsychology references on Wikipedia emanate from these sources. By way of example, CSICOP's leading voice, James Randi, overtly misled grade school teachers in a freely distributed and still available online classroom guide for teaching about parapsychology. Randi instructed teachers to tell inquisitive students that the problem with Rhine's research is that he reported only positive results in his ESP trials. In fact, as explored in Episode 2, when Rhine's lab opened in the early 1930s, it was standard in the behavioral and life sciences to discount experiments with null or negative results. Rhine was among the first academic researchers to flag this common practice and explicitly prohibit it. By 1940, with the publication of Extrasensory Perception After 60 Years, Rhine's lab took a leading role in reporting all results, positive and negative, ahead of the curve of other researchers. After decades in the media, the MacArthur-winning crusader and leading skeptic Randi knew these facts.
I'm James Randi, speaking on behalf of Professor Paul Kurtz, chairman of the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, founded in 1975 by a group of scientists, philosophers, and specialists to provide a possible alternate answer to psychic claims. Among these founders were astronomer Carl Sagan, behaviorist B.F. Skinner, and authors Isaac Asimov and Martin Gardner. The committee has always appreciated Nova's excellent contribution to the public's understanding of science. We were thus deeply disturbed by the case for ESP. Though the first part of the program was well balanced, the second part went beyond standards of careful documentation by presenting highly controversial and disputed studies of apparent paranormal events, as if they demonstrated the existence of supernatural powers. Now, for parapsychologists to tell us stories about selected successes while ignoring requirements of documentation and careful analysis is not science, it is pseudoscience. And Nova viewers should be made aware of that fact. We of the committee have always believed in an open-minded approach to these claims. But in view of the lack of substantiation and adequate replication, we believe that Nova has made a very rare error in the program content offered.
Stay tuned in for even more extraordinary evidence after the break. To say that someone lies implies malice. It is a charge I rarely make. Is it too harsh to say of James Randi's behavior as a professional skeptic? Randi showed further willingness to mislead the public by falsely claiming to independently test paranormal claims and then touting his results to harm reputations. Such was the case with his public rebuttal around 2014 to Cambridge University biologist Rupert Sheldrake. Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance proposes that memory is inherent in nature. The award-winning biologist has written that morphic fields of social groups connect together members of the group even when they are many miles apart and provide channels of communication through which organisms can stay in touch at a distance. They help provide an explanation for telepathy. To this, Randi reported, "We at JREF, James Randi Educational Foundation, have tested these claims. They fail." Yet Sheldrake complained that Randi ignored his requests to see the test data. Reporter Will Storr of Britain's The Telegraph followed up with Randi and received a series of dog-ate-my-homework excuses until the reporter realized that the amazing Randi was either misleading him about the existence of the tests or was proffering an incredibly Byzantine and inconsistent backstory that the results got washed away in a flood. Unbelievable as Randi's responses were, he continued running down the biologist in public. This is what Truzzi dubbed pseudo-skepticism, rejection absent investigation. In this case, it was feigned investigation. Amid Randi's media dings, academics began to recoil. John G. Kruth, today executive director of the Rhine Lab, which functions off-campus, experienced the chill firsthand in the 1980s. As the old guard began to age out of the field, he said, there were very few opportunities for new researchers to study parapsychology. Younger students typically had to travel abroad or design their own study programs. Beyond scholarly circles, Randi set the template for a group of self-described guerrilla skeptics, winners of the 2017 James Randi Educational Foundation Award, who wage a kind of freewheeling digital jihad on Wikipedia, tendentiously reversing or trolling pages about scientific parapsychology and the careers of its key players. While there are lots of anonymous trolls that have worked hard to trash any Wikipedia pages related to psi, including bios of parapsychologists, said Dean Radin, chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, one of the few remaining scholarly parapsychology labs. This group of extreme skeptics is proudly open that they are rewriting history. Any attempt to edit those pages, even fixing individual words, is blocked or reverted almost instantly. Another case was Randi's yearly $1 million challenge, often held in Las Vegas, in which he tempted psychics with a cash prize. For years, it was an annual charade to which virtually no serious observer or claimant would venture near. Journalist and NPR producer Stacey Horn, who wrote about Rhine's lab at Duke University in her 2009 book Unbelievable, queried Randi in June 2008 about his $1 million prize. She told me, I had an exchange with Randi because I was going to have the following sentences about his $1 million prize in my book. To date, Randi's $1 million prize has not been awarded, but according to Chris Carter, author of Parapsychology and the Skeptics, Randi backs off from any serious challenge. I always have an out, he has been quoted as saying. I sent that to Randi to ask him if he really said that. He wrote back saying that the quote was true, but incomplete. What he really said was, I always have an out. I'm right. It seemed like he thought he was being amusing, but I didn't really know a lot about him yet. But it also seemed to indicate that the $1 million prize might not really be a serious offer. So I asked him how a decision was made. Was there a committee, and who was on it? He replied, if someone claims they can fly by flapping their wings, the results don't need any decision. What committee? Why would a committee be required? I don't understand the question. At that point, I wrote him off and decided not to mention his prize in my book, since it just seemed like a publicity stunt for Randi. I have no interest in his personal life. I've never written a word on it. The interest that I have is the terrible damage that he's done to the public's ability, the media's ability, to evaluate and seriously consider parapsychological claims, even to seriously debate them, because Randi, being a master of sound bites and reputational violence, would just take down people whose research, as in the case of Rupert Sheldrake, he literally and actually lied, not honestly lied, but plainly so, lied about replicating. His activities ranged from misleading to dishonest. And his glibness, his willingness to trash facts and reputations, I think have set as bad an example for our culture as the worst political rhetoric, as the worst sarcasm and rhetorical questioning and acerbic language that gets used as a matter of habit on social media. That's the culture Randi's part of. It has nothing to do with cute movie titles. It has nothing to do with what he did or didn't do in his personal life, which I have no interest. It has everything to do with his role as a MacArthur-winning public interlocutor and communicator, and how that role was abused. The Telegraph's store wondered what, besides organizing the yearly Vegas conference, discontinued in 2015, Randi's nonprofit JREF actually does. More recently, I began to wonder about his educational foundation, the JREF, which claims tax-exempt status in the U.S. and is partly dependent on public donations. I wondered what actual educative work the organization, which between 2011 and 2013 had an average revenue of $1.2 million per year, did. Financial documents reveal just $5,100 on average being spent on grants. There are some ebooks, videos, and lesson plans on subjects such as fairies on their website. They organize an annual fan convention. James Randi, over that period, has been paid an average annual salary of $195,000. My requests for details of the Educational Foundation's educational activities over the last 12 months were dodged and then ignored. The 2 years that follow, according to public filings, show executive compensation at an average of over $197,000, more than 20% of the foundation's total yearly revenue. According to a contemporaneous analysis of 100,000 nonprofit CEO salaries, this figure nearly triples the average compensation in JREF's revenue class. The Skeptics' campaigns took their toll. In the midst of post-Cold War budget cuts, President Bill Clinton in 1995 cut funding for Operation Stargate, which over the course of its existence cost about $20 million. This occurred even as President Jimmy Carter that same year spoke publicly about how remote viewers successfully located the crashed Soviet spy jet in Central Africa. Skeptic Ray Hyman, who less than 10 years earlier had collaborated meaningfully with Charles Honorton, returned to excoriate the failures of Stargate to a government panel. President of the American Statistical Association, Jessica Utz, who uses statistical analysis and meta-analysis to study psi, cried foul on him. The two exchanged papers and rebuttals in 1995. But the signal got lost in the noise, and everywhere parapsychology seemed in retreat. More than a decade after his death in 1980, even Rhine's posthumous reputation continued to come under assault. In his 1992 collection of columns, skeptic Martin Gardner claimed in his opening chapter that Rhine had concealed the name of a highly placed cheater at his lab. Rhine tried his best to hush up the scandal, Gardner wrote, but when it was obvious he could not do so, he wrote an apologetic article about it in his journal. As usual, he did not mention Walter Levy's name, apparently under the delusion that readers would not learn the Flim Flanders identity. In fact, Rhine wrote back-to-back columns on the scandal in late 1974 and early 1975. In his second piece, Rhine named the cheater Levy in his opening line. In the same chapter, Gardner, without sourcing, accused one of Rhine's most impressive subjects, Hubert Pierce, of fraud. As noted, from 1931 to 1934, Rhine tested Pierce, then a Duke Divinity student, for ESP hits on Zener cards. Gardner averred that Pierce falsified his famous 25 out of 25 trial run. Gardner added an addendum further impugning Pierce, again without sourcing, and relying for the second time on the phrase, "I have been told." None of his charges are otherwise sourced. Gardner further wrote that Pierce would not communicate with him. In fact, in a letter archived in the Special Collections Library at Duke, Pierce, then a Methodist minister, responded to the skeptic on September 27, 1956. It bears quoting in full. "Dear Mr. Gardner, upon return from a trip to Durham and Washington, I found your interesting letter. I will have to admit that is a new approach, and I wish that I might have had it to show to Dr. Rhine. Of course, you realize that it isn't deserving of a respectable reply. There are a lot of things that might be said to express my opinion of it, and probably of you. May I say simply that I am as much interested in the project now as I was when I was in the university, and the longer I live, the more I become convinced of its reality. Those of us who have worked with Dr. Rhine have never once doubted his ability as a scientist and research director, his devotion to the truth, his brilliance, or his integrity. You are simply beating again the path that was beat by experts in the 1930s. The day will come when Dr. Rhine's name will be among the immortals and the names of his critics forgotten. Sincerely, Hubert E. Pierce."
Russell Targ has a more unorthodox response to his critics.
Well, there's of course no way to deal with people who don't want to know. By and large, the critics who've been interested enough in our work to come to our laboratory, we have asked them to take part in experiments and experience remote viewing themselves. We'll sit them down, have someone go and hide in the Bay Area, and then with a lot of preparation on their part, we will be able to elicit a remote viewing description from them, which is often very accurate indeed. And the activity of experiencing successful psychic functioning has been a substantial motivation to skeptical people change their mind.
More extraordinary evidence when we return. So much has been said about the poor character of professional skepticism as a field. It's not something I want to see myself get obsessively engrossed in, because the examples are ever multiplying, and if you plant your flag in that territory, you'll never get off it. But one of the things I would say is that a man like Marcello Truzzi was an authentic skeptic. He demonstrated the ability to bring skeptics and parapsychologists together in the pages of a journal. He, I think, fulfilled his own self-description as a constructive skeptic of paranormal phenomena. And I wish that there was a young person or a not so young person who were trained in the social sciences and who maybe looked to Truzzi as a model. He could provide a wonderful model for a new intellectual career for one or more people. And such a person, intellectually, if not organizationally, would rise to the top of the skeptics field very quickly, and would be the kind of person I would want to collaborate with and debate. We need someone like that, and it only takes one person, one capable, driven, intellectually vibrant person to say, that's what I want to do. That job is open, folks. I think someone listening should apply for it. One may fairly ask whether any of this brouhaha finally matters. I believe so on two levels. One, the kind of misinformation that I've described and limiting the examples is its own challenge, is often recycled in journalism and reference literature, particularly the world's go-to resource, Wikipedia. 2. We urgently need good skeptics, worthy of the term. Neither parapsychology nor any science can thrive without them. Personally speaking, my sympathies for parapsychology are self-evident. I describe myself as a critical but believing historian of the occult and esoteric, and I spent years as a publisher of New Age literature. I am hardly anyone's idea of a poster child for disinterest. But if my approach is reproving, I hope it is attributable to something beyond those factors. In years of personal encounters, I have observed, and I am unsure why, that the field of professional skepticism, including bloggers, writers, wiki contributors, and some scientists, seems to attract an outsized number of cynics. They appear convinced that others harbor similar values, and in my observation, many seem unable to recognize transparency and good practices. Indeed, it may be a general malady of human nature that we cannot see traits other than our own. On different terms, 20th century spiritual philosopher G.I. Gurdjieff observed how the line of development of forces deviates from its original direction and goes, after a certain time, in a diametrically opposite direction, still preserving its former name. In that vein, the crisis of professional skepticism presents an irony in which self-perceived defenders of reason brutalize truth in its name. That is the antithesis of good science, good criticism, and good ethics. Our culture needs a new cohort of skeptics who strive to do better. Thank you for listening to Extraordinary Evidence, ESP is Real. This series was produced by Jim Perry and John McEdward for Spectre Vision Radio, edited by John McEdward, with original music by Dean Hurley, written and narrated by me, Mitch Horowitz. Join us for Episode 5, Reincarnation, Randomness, and Retro-Causality. Remarkably, even amid the onslaught of obfuscation, funding cuts, and reputational attacks, new parapsychologists continue to enter the fold and produce remarkable work, furthering the field's reach and purview.
If present physics cannot explain these phenomena, that means that physics isn't complete, and physicists are quite used to drastic changes. They have changed their worldview in the past very often. And so I would expect in the long run a merging between science research and physics.